My last podcast was about one man's opinion and the effect of the American Civil War on Christianity. Well, this podcast, I'm going to briefly cover Christianity's influence on the American Revolution of 1776. Now, if you ask a middle school student, where do our rights come from, according to the founders of this nation? And they'll probably say, the government. But that's not true. The founders said that our rights come from God. They would have never said the government, but only because they didn't talk that way back then. They would have either said that it comes from God, not the king, like those rebellious founders, or they would have just said that our rights come from King George III. I'll give you one quick example. Scottish nobleman John Stuart III, Earl of Bute. Listen to that. The third Earl of Bute. He believed that King George III had a divine right to rule. So back then, the only conceivable options were the king, who must have servants, or God. And that's a huge difference. Now, if you ask those same students that I referred to earlier, do our rights come from King George III? What do you think they'd say then? The king? No way, please. So the point is, ours is a government of law, not a government of one-man rule. Now, of course, during the time of the Revolution, there were lots of ideas flowing around at the time about doing a different type of government that didn't depend on a king. And all those ideas were converging together, different ways of thinking, philosophical, tapping into the Greeks, the Romans, but also Christianity, biblical Christianity. The writings of John Locke, for example, influenced the American War of Independence and the French Revolution. Locke and Jean Rousseau, another influencer of the time, they both believed in the sovereignty of the people. That is, that the idea is that the right to rule is granted only by the consent of those governed. Of course, this notion was a direct contradiction to other man-made constructs regarding rulership, such as the divine right of kings, or the right to rule on the basis of birth or nobility, and so forth. Now, Locke argued that all men are created equal. And Thomas Jefferson, who actually wrote the Declaration of Independence, considered Locke to be part of what Jefferson called the trinity of the three greatest men the world had ever produced. And so we read in the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Locke was a devout Christian, and he didn't keep his religious views private. They seemed to have a greater tolerance of free expression back then, because he exerted considerable effort to defend and promote his Christian beliefs with works such as The Reasonableness of Christianity as Delivered in the Scriptures, which he published in 1695. And then he wrote A Vindication of the Reasonableness of Christianity in 1697. That same year, he followed up with A Second Vindication of the Reasonableness of Christianity in 1697. Now, if you read those, and by the way, don't forget, Mark Twain is the one who said that the man who does not read good books has no advantage over the man who can't read them. So if you read Locke's work, you'll clearly see that the man with whom Thomas Jefferson held in high regard, Locke, he was someone whose religious views informed his views on human nature, which in turn informed his perspective on government. Specifically, how to do government given what human beings are like. See, the idea is to oversimplify it, it's avoid one-man rule. But to go a bit deeper, influenced by his Christian views, he would say human nature became corrupted by Adam's sin, thus creating the need for a savior. But this sinful nature, while not to be fully trusted, hence the division of power, executive, legislative, judicial. Anyways, human nature becomes corrupt with Adam's sin, thus creating the need for a savior. But this sinful nature, while not to be fully trusted, is by no means unequal to any other person's sinful nature. So the sinful servants are not unequal to the sinful king. And Locke, by the way, was Anglican. Now, regarding this nature of man, Jefferson could look for proof not merely to the philosophical underpinnings of the inherent selfishness within man, but the record of human history itself with its empirical evidence proving over and over again that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Thus, the separation of powers was born, with the ultimate court of arbitration residing with the populace, or we, the people. But I think this next quote will surprise a lot of people. Just hear me out. Now, here's a guy who tells you plainly the religious motives behind the American Revolution, and not just religious motives in general, but Christian motives in particular. Okay, so I know you're probably thinking, okay, so fine, you found one guy who said Christianity propelled him forward to revolution, but that's just one guy, right? That's not a lot of them. Well, no. This guy wasn't even for the American Revolution. He disagreed with the 13 colonies, even while he lived among them. So the guy who is against the American Revolution tells us that those rebels are motivated by Christian ideals, which, by the way, he disagrees with. But then, when he sees there's no turning back from this war, he packs up his bags, hops on a ship, travels overseas, and he ends up living a very comfortable life far away from these United States recently formed. But I'm getting ahead of the story. The man is Miles Cooper, and he said this at the University of Oxford. Even in the Old English, you can easily pick up his meaning. In order to engage the Americans in general to promote their designs, its conductors, that is, the conductors of this rebellion, pretended that a regular system was formed by a corrupt and abandoned administration for oppressing and enslaving the colonies, of which every exercise of authority over them, however expedient or usual, was alleged as convincing proof that such acts were invasions of their natural rights, of their chartered privileges, and even of that inalienable liberty wherewith Christ had made them free. Unquote. The colonies, he said, were claiming in the Declaration of Independence that what was happening to them was an invasion of their natural rights and even of that inalienable liberty wherewith Christ had made them free. This is Cooper's take. And he lived through these tumultuous times. He's not confused, as some people are today, as to whether Christianity motivated the American Revolution or didn't motivate it. And he was a loyalist, and there were many like him. And as a loyalist, get this, he tries to answer the founders' religious objection to one-man rule. Listen to him. When men's principles are wrong, their practices will seldom be right. And by the way, I'll include a link to all of this in the show notes. He says that their heads are filled with ideas that those powers are to be derived solely from the people, because that's ordained of God. He's saying they're using God, in other words, to justify this rebellion. Remember earlier? Inalienable liberty wherewith Christ had made them free. When they talk like that, he goes on to say, they confuse the duties of rulers and subjects and perpetually dictate where it is their business to simply obey. I read that as just shut up and obey. Quit trying to perpetually dictate. You're not the subjects. You're the subjects, rather, not the ruler. But here's how he puts it in the next line. When once they, that is the colonists, conceive the governed to be superior to the governors, and that they may set up their pretended natural rights in opposition to the positive law of the states, they will naturally proceed to despise dominion and speak evil, and open a door for anarchy and confusion. Honor the king, he says. That's your duty. And yet some of those colonists would have said, we have no king but Jesus. So you can see there's more going on here than no taxation without representation, which is what this war is often reduced to when the religious beliefs underpinning the revolution are unexamined. Again, thanks for listening. Please be sure to subscribe to get notification when the next podcast is available.